Behold the mighty GPO, the General Post Office of Sydney. There sure is a lot to see with this building, both inside and out, but I recommend taking a view of its centrepiece, which is a statue of Queen Victoria in white marble, which is located right in the centre of the building if you're standing in Martin Place at the Anzac Cenotaph, which are those two soldiers at a war memorial. We'll talk about that sculpture in a little bit. You may notice, looking above at all of the sculptural reliefs, the date 1883, and that's when a lot of the ornamentation of this building was completed. And because this was such an internationally significant building, being the postal connection and telegraph connection from Sydney to the world, I think it might be a good idea just to give a sense of context as to what was going on in the rest of the world at that time in 1883. In May, the Brooklyn Bridge was opened in New York to traffic, and that was after 13 years of construction. It's still going strong and a real icon of architecture itself. In August, the eruption of Krakatoa. Now, that took place on the small island of Krakatoa in Indonesia. The eruption wiped out hundreds of villages nearby and killed up to 37,000 people, and was a huge event worldwide. Also in 1883, we saw the death of German communist philosopher Karl Marx. And in the context of architecture, in that very year, Antonio Gaudi started work on the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. And in Sydney, people did complain that the General Post Office took a long time to complete, 25 years or so in the late 19th century. But as of 2023, Sagrada Familia in Barcelona is still under construction, having begun in 1883. So there you go. Now, the GPO, the General Post Office, was very, very important at this age because it was really Sydney's connection to the rest of the world. Prior to this time, up until around the 1850s, letters and information, newspapers that arrived in Sydney really just came in with the ships, merchant ships, trading ships, immigration ships. So it was very inconsistent to get messages from the UK or from Europe, where most people were desperate for all of the events that were going on. Then in the 1850s, we had Royal Mail liners, whose specific task was to carry letters and post and information. By 1869, the Suez Canal was opened, and that allowed steamships to really speed up the journey from the UK or Europe to Sydney, so mail and information could get here a lot quicker. But it wasn't until 1872 that the overland and underwater telegraph cable was connected, and this was a big feat. Essentially what it meant was that a lot of cables connected Sydney all the way to London, so that a telegraph sent from here could zip through all of the Australian continent, underwater, over islands, into Asia, Middle East, and then eventually to Europe and across to the UK, so that information could be direct. And what was called the tyranny of distance, that is, Sydney and Australia's great isolation, being this Western colonial world that was so far removed from its motherland, could suddenly have instant access to all of the news, all the information from the rest of the world. And of course, the telegraph zipped straight to the General Post Office. So this became a real hub for all sorts of things, including financial information, global news, and just this idea that personal messages could be sent, so the general public could come into the General Post Office and put together a telegraph which could be zipped back to their friends and family in the UK or Europe. That was a big change of scene to Sydney, and it made the General Post Office the real hub of the city. In terms of architecture, the building had a few different stages. Originally, when it started in 1866, it was a smaller, blocky building which faced George Street. In fact, if you wander over to the George Street side, you'll see another entrance there with a protruding clock that comes off the building, which has been there from the 19th century as well, time being very important to telegraph and post. Over the next 2 decades, the building was extended all the way to Pitt Street, and that meant that it'd have a big frontage on what was really just a small laneway, only a few meters wide, called Martin's Lane. But to allow the building to be seen in all its glory, they needed to widen that lane, and that became Martin Place as we have it today. So really the whole financial district and busy city hub that is Martin Place can thank the fact that people wanted to see the post office a little bit more prominently in that space when it was constructed. The extension of the building led towards many more sculptures that were added to be the facade that one would see looking at the building from Martin Place. And you may notice there's some interesting faces that decorate the wall. Now, this was all about showing how connected Sydney was to different places around the world, and each face represents a different country or continent or even a different colony within Australia. So we get some very interesting designs and very late 19th century stereotypical versions of what people thought these places represented. You can see the figures representing Europe, Asia, Russia, Italy, Germany, United States, Canada, India, France, Belgium, Austria, Polynesia, and then there's a set dedicated to Australian colonies and New Zealand, and others that represent the proud faces of England, Scotland, one that represents all of Africa, and another that represents all of South America. So today these particular faces are a little bit out of date and probably wouldn't be sculpted onto a civil building, but they do stand there as kind of an exotic testament to how much this particular structure, the GPO, felt it was reaching to the rest of the world, and that this building was the real hub of international Sydney. As for the other aspects of the building itself, the tower you can see rising above was the tallest structure in Sydney for a very long time. It was completed in 1885 and it was a real beacon in the city. It stood right out, so when you sailed in by ship to Sydney Harbour, you could see it there standing with its proud clock and know where to go to get your information. But in 1942, in the heat of the Second World War, the tower was seen to be too tall and too prominent, and that it might become a target for potential Japanese air raids and bombings. Thus, it was completely taken down and wasn't rebuilt to its former glory until the 1960s. As a working building through the late 19th century and into the 20th century, the post office had a huge sorting room in the basement, and hundreds of thousands of letters would be dropped through chutes down to a sorting table, and an army of employees would be sorting them out. Remember, letters were going in and out of this building from all around the world, but as the world of post became less important, this particular building, in all of its Italian Renaissance sandstone architectural glory, was converted into a hotel in 1996. But you can still wander into the foyer of the building and have a look at its interior features, which I recommend you to do, including one of the last old-fashioned red postal boxes in Sydney that is still accepting letters. While outside the General Post Office, you'll notice the Anzac Cenotaph. This was completed in 1929 as a memorial for the First World War, and still to this day the Anzac Dawn service begins at Martin Place, with thousands of people coming to pay their respects and tributes to fallen soldiers, and the General Post Office and other prominent buildings in Martin Place are illuminated with historic photos from wartime. Feel free to have a bit more of an explore of Martin Place, because there's no shortage of very impressive buildings, a lot of them from the early 20th century in the form of magnificent banks. It really became the financial hub of the city over the 20th century, but we are going to continue on down some hidden laneways that sit behind this grand promenade and continue our journey towards Circular Quay.